A billionaire saw a homeless girl, dressed in very dirty, tattered and torn outfit, with dreadlocks hair, teaching his daughter with chalk on the pavement. But when he secretly followed her home, he froze. His breath caught. His hands trembled, because what he discovered inside that abandoned building would change everything. Richard Caldwell's chauffeur-driven black Mercedes idled outside St. Mary's Academy, one of the most exclusive schools in New York. Inside the car, Richard sat stiff in his navy suit, his wristwatch gleaming as he tapped his fingers against the armrest. The bell had just rung, and children poured out of the gates, their laughter and chatter spilling into the afternoon air. Parents in designer coats clustered near the curb, while nannies rushed forward to collect their charges. Richard's daughter, 10-year-old Lila Caldwell, walked out alone, head bent, clutching her backpack straps. She had grown quieter since her mother's death 2 years ago. Even surrounded by classmates, she seemed like a shadow among them. Richard's chest tightened watching her. He had built skyscrapers, companies, entire industries, but he had no blueprint for repairing his daughter's broken smile. Then something unusual caught his eye. Just beyond the iron gates, on the cracked sidewalk, a teenage girl knelt on the pavement. She was barefoot, her jeans torn at the knees, and her shirt hung loose on her thin frame. Her dark curls were tied back with a string, and her skin carried the sun's roughness, too much time outdoors, not enough care. She held a stub of white chalk in her hand. Richard leaned forward, frowning. Lila had stopped in front of the girl, and instead of brushing past as most wealthy children might, she crouched beside her. The girl drew numbers across the pavement in a messy but certain hand, 7 times 8 is equal to 56, and explained patiently. Her voice, though faint from the distance, carried a calm authority. Lila's lips curved upward as she repeated the answer, her eyes lighting in a way Richard hadn't seen in months. For a long moment, Richard forgot the chauffeur, the car, the street. All he saw was his daughter smiling, listening, learning, from a homeless stranger. Lila laughed softly, clapping her hands when she solved a problem correctly. Then she leaned forward and hugged the girl. The girl froze at first, as though affection were foreign to her, then awkwardly patted Lila's shoulder. Richard's throat tightened. His daughter had hugged no one since her mother's funeral. The chauffeur glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Sir, shall we?" But Richard raised his hand sharply. "Wait." The girl gathered her few belongings, a plastic bag, the stub of chalk, and rose to her feet. Lila whispered something that made the girl smile faintly. Then Lila hurried toward the waiting car, her cheeks glowing pink. Richard's window hummed down as Lila slipped inside. "Who was that?" Richard asked carefully. "My teacher," Lila whispered, clutching her backpack. Richard's heart pounded. He had hired private tutors at astronomical rates, yet this ragged teenager had accomplished what no professional had, coaxing his daughter back to life. As the car pulled away, Richard kept his eyes fixed on the girl walking toward the distant streets. Then, with a tone quiet but firm, he told the chauffeur. "Follow her." The Mercedes glided through the streets at a careful distance. Richard leaned forward, his sharp eyes following the thin figure of the girl as she weaved through pedestrians. She walked quickly, head down, clutching her plastic bag as if it contained treasures no one else would value. "Keep some distance," Richard muttered to the chauffeur. "Don't let her notice." "Yes, sir." The afternoon sun gave way to shadows as the girl left the bustling avenues of Midtown and slipped into the rougher edges of the city. The polished storefronts faded into graffiti-stained walls. Here, the sidewalks were cracked, litter blowing against the curbs. Richard's chest grew tight. It was a part of New York he rarely acknowledged. He'd built towers to block out these streets, not face them. Finally, the girl turned down a narrow alley. She pushed open the door of a half-collapsed building, its bricks crumbling, windows boarded. Richard raised a hand. "Stop here." He stepped out of the car. The air was damp with mildew and faintly sour. For a moment, he hesitated, this was reckless. He was a billionaire, a man with enemies, and here he was sneaking after a child into a ruin. Yet something pulled him forward, stronger than fear, the memory of his daughter smiling. Inside, the building smelled of dust and damp earth. Shafts of light pierced through cracks in the ceiling, falling onto broken furniture and scattered trash. Richard's shoes crunched against gravel as he followed the faint sound of a voice. He stopped. The girl knelt beside a thin mattress on the floor. A small boy, no older than 8, lay curled on it, coughing weakly. His skin was pale, his chest heaving as though each breath cost him dearly. The girl pulled a frayed blanket over him, whispering softly. "I saved you some bread, Toby," she said, pulling a piece of hardened crust from her bag. She dipped it into a chipped cup of water and held it to his lips. "Eat slowly. Doctor said your chest needs rest." The boy shook his head. "I'm not hungry, Amara." "You eat." So that was her name, Amara. Richard's heart clenched as he watched. The girl tore the bread in half, placing one piece firmly in his hand. "You must eat. I'll teach you your sums after, okay?" She smoothed his hair, humming softly, her voice trembling yet gentle. In that moment, Richard saw more than a homeless girl. He saw a protector, a teacher, a mother figure, all packed into her frail body. He leaned against the wall, overwhelmed. All the tutors, therapists, counselors he had hired, none of them had given Lila the simple devotion this girl offered freely. Richard slipped out quietly, his mind racing. A brother with asthma. A girl who still found time to teach others. This was more than chance, this was a story he couldn't ignore. Back in the car, his chauffeur glanced at him. "What now, sir?" Richard stared out the window, jaw set. "We watch. We learn who she is. And why she's teaching my daughter when the world has given her nothing." The following day, Richard Caldwell sat in his corner office on the 48th floor of Caldwell Global Tower. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the New York skyline, but his eyes weren't on the view. He kept replaying the image of the barefoot girl kneeling on cracked pavement, teaching his daughter multiplication with chalk, then later feeding her coughing brother with scraps of bread. Richard had built his empire on numbers, profit margins, acquisition costs, quarterly growth. But these numbers gnawed at him differently. 7 times 8. 56. One girl, one brother, 0 safety net. By evening, he was back in the black Mercedes, instructing his chauffeur to return to the half-collapsed building. The street seemed even harsher at night. Street lamps flickered. The smell of garbage lingered in the air. Yet Richard walked in without hesitation. Amara was there, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her brother. She was writing in a battered notebook, lips moving silently as she worked out sums. Her chalk-stained fingers clutched the stub of a pencil as though it were gold. Richard cleared his throat gently. She spun around, alarm flashing in her dark eyes. She quickly shielded her brother with one arm, like a lioness before a cub. "Who are you?" Her voice was sharp, almost feral. Richard raised his hands, palms open. "I'm not here to hurt you." "You followed me," she accused. "Yes," Richard admitted. "Because my daughter smiled yesterday for the first time in months. And it was because of you." Her grip on the pencil loosened slightly, confusion breaking through suspicion. "Your daughter. Lila Caldwell. You helped her outside her school." Amara's gaze softened, just a little. She was struggling with her numbers. "I couldn't walk away. No child should feel dumb just because no one explained it properly." Richard nodded slowly. "You believe that?" Amara's chin lifted. "I know that. My mother used to say education is the only inheritance that can't be stolen. But after she died, her voice faltered, then steadied. No one gave us that chance. So I teach myself. And if I can help another child, even for a moment, I will." The conviction in her words hit Richard harder than any boardroom argument. "Your brother, Toby, right?" Richard asked gently. She glanced at the boy, who was dozing fitfully. "Asthma. It gets worse in the winter. Medicine costs money we don't have." Silence stretched between them, heavy with truths neither wanted to say aloud. Richard finally spoke. "You shouldn't have to carry this burden alone." Amara stiffened. "We've managed so far. We don't need pity." "It's not pity," Richard said softly. "It's gratitude. You helped my daughter when you had nothing to give. Let me find a way to help you." Amara's eyes searched his face, skeptical yet weary. Her world had only ever taken. But something in his tone, earnest, almost broken, made her pause. At last, she whispered, "If you want to help, don't take my brother from me. He's all I have." Richard's chest tightened. He nodded once, firmly. "I promise." 2 days later, Richard Caldwell sat alone in his private study. Papers and reports lay scattered across the mahogany desk, but he wasn't focused on the quarterly forecasts. Instead, he had ordered his executive assistant to dig through decades of company archives. Somewhere in the past, he felt, was the thread that connected him to the girl named Amara. At midnight, his assistant delivered a worn file box. "This was buried in human resources, sir. From 17 years ago." Richard dismissed him and opened the box himself. Inside, yellowed forms bore familiar company logos, filled out in careful handwriting. One name appeared again and again, Grace Adeyemi. Richard froze. He remembered her faintly, one of the cleaning staff at Caldwell Global. She had worked nights, scrubbing the marble floors long after executives had gone home. The records showed her petitions for medical assistance when she was diagnosed with cervical cancer. The pleas were formal but desperate. "I humbly request the company's health coverage extend to my treatment. My children are still very young. I need more time." The forms had been stamped with a red "denied." Richard rubbed his temples, remembering. At that time, the company had cut costs ruthlessly. He himself had signed off on blanket policy changes, denying non-contract staff any medical coverage. He hadn't known her name then, but his pen had sealed her fate. Grace Adeyemi. Amara's mother. The weight of it crushed him. The girl teaching his daughter on the pavement, the boy gasping for breath in the abandoned building, they were orphans partly because of him. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the city lights outside. Billboards with his name lit the skyline, yet what good was all his empire if a single stroke of his pen had destroyed a family? The next morning, he returned to the abandoned building. Amara eyed him warily as he entered, her arms folded across her chest. "You came back again," she said flatly. "Yes." Richard hesitated. "I learned something. About your mother." Amara stiffened. "What about her?" "She worked for me," Richard admitted. His voice carried shame more than authority. "At Caldwell Global. She begged us for help with her treatment. The company denied her. His throat tightened. "I signed the papers that made it happen. I didn't know her name then, but ignorance is no excuse." The air seemed to still around them. Amara's eyes burned with anger. "So you're saying my mother died because you couldn't be bothered to care?" Richard lowered his head. "Yes." For a long moment, only Toby's faint coughing filled the silence. Amara's hands shook as she clenched them into fists. But then her voice, low and fierce, cut through the air. "You can't undo the past. You can't bring her back. But if you mean even one word of what you're saying, then prove you're different now. Help me keep my brother alive. Help me give children what my mother never got, education." Richard met her gaze, humbled. "I will. Whatever it takes." The following week, Richard arrived at the abandoned building not with questions but with action. His chauffeur carried in a portable oxygen tank, while two medical specialists trailed behind with bags of equipment. Amara sprang up defensively the moment they entered, her eyes flashing. "What is this? Who are these people?" she demanded, standing between them and her brother. "They're doctors," Richard said calmly. "Your brother doesn't need to suffer like this." Amara shook her head furiously. "No. You'll take him away. That's what people like you always do, you take." One of the doctors, a gentle middle-aged woman, raised her hands. "We only want to help him breathe easier. No hospitals unless you agree. Please, let us listen to his chest." Amara's chest heaved, torn between fear and her brother's wheezing gasps. Finally, she gave a short nod. The doctors knelt, checked Toby with a stethoscope, and attached the oxygen mask. Within minutes, his breathing steadied. The boy's eyelids fluttered open, and he whispered, "Amara. I can breathe." Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly, glaring at Richard. "Why are you doing this? Out of guilt? Because you signed papers that killed my mother?" Richard swallowed hard. "Yes. And because you helped my daughter when you had nothing. I want to prove I'm not the same man who once ignored your family's cries." Amara's expression was unreadable. She crouched beside Toby, stroking his hair as he dozed peacefully under the mask. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a low voice, she began to speak, not to Richard, but almost to herself. "After Mama died, our father left. Said he couldn't handle 2 children and a mountain of debt. We had nowhere to go. That's when Mama's best friend, Mrs. Durojayi, took us in. She promised she'd treat us like her own children. She swore she'd put me in school and make sure Toby had medicine." Her lips curled bitterly. "Instead, she turned us into slaves. Every morning, I carried trays of bottled water on my head, walking barefoot in the hot sun, shouting for customers. When I begged her to let me attend classes, she laughed in my face. 'Education isn't for street rats,' she said." Toby washed her floors, polished her children's shoes, and still went to bed hungry. The woman who called herself Mama's best friend, humiliated us until we ran away. Richard's jaw tightened as he listened. Every word painted a sharper picture of betrayal. Amara looked up at him, her eyes blazing. "So forgive me if I don't trust you, Mr. Caldwell. Promises mean nothing to me. I only believe what I see." Richard stepped closer, his voice steady but soft. "Then watch me. I'll show you." The silence between them was thick, her defiance against his resolve. Finally, she turned her face away, whispering only, "Don't fail me. Don't fail him." The following weeks blurred into a rhythm Amara could hardly believe. Doctors returned regularly, supplying Toby with inhalers and monitoring his lungs. Richard arranged for discreet deliveries, boxes of food, blankets, books, though he insisted Amara distribute them herself, so she would never feel stripped of dignity. Still, Amara kept her guard. Each time Richard appeared, she studied him like a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. His wealth, his clean suits, his easy authority, they belonged to a world that had spat on her family. And yet, when she saw him crouch down to speak gently with Toby or watch Lila's face light up at Amara's lessons, she couldn't deny something was shifting. One evening, as she packed away her chalk and worn notebook, Richard asked, "If you had the chance, what would you build for children like you?" Amara paused. Her fingers tightened around the notebook. She thought of Mrs. Durojayi's voice ringing in her ears, "Education isn't for street rats." The sting of those words had never left her. "I'd build a school," Amara said slowly. "Not just classrooms, but a place where no child is turned away because of money. Where a girl selling water bottles can still learn her ABCs." Her jaw clenched. "And I'd make sure the world knew exactly whose cruelty pushed me there." Richard tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Amara looked him squarely in the eye. Mrs. Durojayi. My mother's so-called best friend. She promised to raise us, to give us a future. Instead, she made me hawk water barefoot in the streets while her own children rode to school in shiny uniforms. She stole my childhood. Her voice lowered to a whisper edged with fire. If I ever build that school, I'll name it after her. So every time people celebrate children getting education, her name will stand as a monument, not to her kindness, but to the justice she denied us. That will be my revenge. Richard was silent for a long moment. He had seen hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, even betrayals within his boardroom, but nothing compared to the quiet fury in this girl's voice. It wasn't the rage of destruction, it was the rage of transformation. Finally, he said, then let's make it happen. Amara blinked. You're serious? As serious as I've ever been. We'll build it together. But only if you're ready to lead it. Her chest rose and fell. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, a billionaire offering to build a school with a barefoot girl from the streets. Yet when she imagined the sign above the gates, the Durojayi Education Trust, her heart thudded. Revenge could be sharp, yes, but it could also be righteous. She closed the notebook carefully. If we do this, Mr. Caldwell, it's not for pity. It's for justice. He nodded. Justice it is. By winter's first snow, life for Amara and Toby had transformed. No longer did they curl on a thin mattress in a moldy ruin. Richard had moved them into a modest but warm apartment near Central Park. The walls were freshly painted, the kitchen stocked, and Toby had a real bed with clean sheets. At night, he slept without the wheeze of desperation, thanks to the steady hiss of a prescribed inhaler. Amara, however, felt restless in the quiet safety. Comfort was unfamiliar. Each time she folded her brother's blanket or set the books neatly on a shelf, her mind flashed back to the sting of hawking bottled water in the sun, her bare feet burning against asphalt while Mrs. Durojayi's children jeered at her from the air-conditioned back seat of their car. Now, when she stood before Lila Caldwell at the dining table, guiding her through multiplication and spelling, she held her head higher. She was no longer a shadow slipping through alleys. She was a teacher, valued, respected. And every laugh from Lila, every hug of gratitude, reminded Amara that she was rewriting her own story. One afternoon, Richard called her into his study. Lila perched nearby, proudly showing Toby a drawing she had made of the four of them together. Richard leaned forward. It's time we make the foundation official. A school, scholarships, outreach programs, the works. The media will cover it. And I think you should be the one to announce it. Amara hesitated, nerves fluttering in her chest. Me? You're the reason it exists, Richard said firmly. And you already have the name. Her lips tightened. The Durojayi Education Trust. He nodded. It's bold. But it tells a story. Not of her cruelty, but of your triumph. A week later, the press event unfolded in a downtown hall. Cameras flashed, reporters filled rows, and a banner draped across the stage read, launching the Durojayi Education Trust. When Amara stepped up to the podium, the crowd hushed. She wore a simple white dress Richard's assistant had found for her, but her posture was regal, her gaze steady. Some names, she began, her voice carrying across the hall, are remembered for the pain they cause. But I believe in turning pain into purpose. The woman whose name crowns this foundation once told me education wasn't for children like me. Today, I dedicate every scholarship, every book, every classroom to proving her wrong. Gasps rippled through the crowd. And then, near the back, a familiar face stiffened, Mrs. Durojayi herself, her expensive scarf trembling at her throat. Her lips pursed in outrage as cameras swiveled toward her. Amara met her gaze squarely, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. This trust will give children what I was denied, she said, voice firm. That is my revenge. Not cruelty for cruelty, but justice for every child silenced. Applause thundered. Reporters swarmed. Mrs. Duroji fled through the side doors, her reputation unraveling in public humiliation. Amara's chest lifted. For the first time, revenge didn't taste bitter. It tasted like freedom. The morning after the launch of the Duroji Education Trust, headlines flooded New York. Homeless girl becomes founder of Education Trust. Billionaire Caldwell backstreet teen's vision. Who is Amara Adeyemi? News vans camped outside the new office space Richard had secured for the foundation. Amara was overwhelmed by the cameras, the reporters calling her name, the constant questions. Yet she held her head high, answering calmly, her story spreading faster than she imagined. But not all questions were about her. Some reporters dug deeper, into her mother's past, her years on the streets, and into Richard Caldwell's involvement. One journalist uncovered a damning truth. Grace Adeyemi had once worked at Caldwell Global, her pleas for medical aid denied by company policy. Within hours, the whispers became roars. Was Caldwell's support an act of conscience, or cover-up? That evening, Richard sat in his penthouse library, firelight flickering across his face as he watched the news. His advisors urged him to issue a statement denying personal involvement, to blame faceless corporate policy. It was the easy way out. But when he thought of Amara, of her fierce honesty, he knew denial would destroy everything she had built. He called a press conference the next morning. The hall was packed, cameras flashing as Richard stepped onto the stage. His tailored suit was immaculate, but his shoulders carried a weight that humbled him. Amara sat in the front row beside Lila and Toby, her face tense with uncertainty. Richard adjusted the microphone. His voice, when it came, was steady but raw. 17 years ago, a woman named Grace Adeyemi worked in my company as a cleaner. She begged for help with her medical bills. Those pleas crossed my desk. And I, too busy, too focused on numbers and profit, signed policies that denied her. She died without the care she deserved. Her children, Amara and Toby, suffered because of decisions I made. Gasps rippled through the hall. I cannot undo the past, Richard continued, his gaze sweeping the room. But I refuse to hide from it. Amara has taught me more about dignity, courage, and the true meaning of education than any executive or advisor ever has. I stand beside her, not as a benefactor, but as a man who failed and is determined to do better. He turned slightly toward Amara. If she will allow it, I will support her foundation for the rest of my life. Silence hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then applause erupted, louder than the night before. Some clapped for Amara's resilience, others for Richard's humility, but together, the sound was thunderous. Amara's eyes burned with tears she didn't try to hide. For years, she had carried her mother's death as a silent burden. Now the man responsible had not only admitted it, he had given her the platform to turn that pain into power. For the first time, she believed his promise. Within weeks, the Duroji Education Trust became the most talked about initiative in New York. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, and children from shelters lined up with bright eyes and eager notebooks. For the first time, Amara saw kids like herself sitting at real desks, pencils in hand, free from the weight of street hawking. Toby, healthier now, often helped hand out books. Lila joined the after-school sessions, giggling with the other students, her grief loosening its grip. The sight filled Richard with quiet pride. The girl who once knelt with chalk on a sidewalk was now standing before a classroom, her voice clear, her purpose undeniable. But not everyone celebrated. One chilly afternoon, Amara returned from a meeting with city officials to find whispers buzzing through the schoolyard. Parents huddled together, shaking their heads. Children glanced at her with confusion. She pushed through the crowd, her stomach tightening. On the bulletin board outside the entrance, a stack of photocopied flyers had been pinned up. Across the top, bold letters screamed. Truth about Amara Adeyemi, fraud, liar, street rat. Her breath caught. The paper listed half-truths twisted into accusations, that she had lied about her past, that she was using Richard's money for herself, that she wasn't fit to teach children because she had no formal education. At the bottom, in small but unmistakable script, was the name, Mrs. Folktale. A cold fire spread through Amara's veins. She had expected whispers, maybe gossip, but not this, an outright attempt to drag her back into the dirt she had fought so hard to escape. "Is it true?" a parent asked sharply, waving one of the flyers. "You never even finished school." Amara's throat tightened. She wanted to shout, to scream that it wasn't her fault, that she'd begged for a classroom while Mrs. Duroji chained her to bottled water trays. But the sting of humiliation pressed her tongue. Richard arrived minutes later, striding through the crowd. He ripped one of the flyers down and crumpled it in his fist. His voice boomed across the yard. "This woman," he gestured to Amara, "has done more for education in 1 month than most of us have in a lifetime. Yes, she was denied school. That's the very injustice this trust exists to correct. And if anyone dares to call her unworthy, then they are blind to the truth standing before them." The crowd murmured, some chastened, others still skeptical. Amara lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Mrs. Duroji wants the world to remember me as a street rat. But I will make sure the world remembers me as the girl who turned water bottles into books, and shame into hope." Applause broke out. Tentative at first, then stronger. Parents tore down the rest of the flyers. Somewhere in the shadows, Mrs. Duroji watched, her face twisted with fury. But Amara no longer flinched under her gaze. The revenge she had planted was blooming, and no paper smear could uproot it. 2 weeks later, Amara sat nervously in a polished oak chamber at City Hall. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting sharp beams across the long table where council members shuffled papers and adjusted microphones. Richard sat at her side, his presence calm and commanding, but he let her sit in the lead chair. This was her fight, her voice. The council chair cleared his throat. "Ms. Adeyemi, you've applied for recognition of the Duroji Education Trust as an official nonprofit, eligible for city grants. Some citizens have raised concerns about your qualifications." Amara's palms sweated, but she took a breath and remembered Toby's words that morning. "You always told me, sis, education is more than classrooms. Show them." She spoke slowly, clearly. "I was denied an education because of poverty, and because of betrayal. My mother's best friend, Mrs. Folktale, promised me school, but instead she sent me to hawk bottled water on hot streets while her children studied. She told me education wasn't for children like me. That shame nearly destroyed me. But I taught myself. I taught my brother. I even taught Mr. Caldwell's daughter. And now I'm teaching hundreds." Murmurs spread through the chamber. Richard leaned back, letting the weight of her testimony sink in. Amara continued, her voice growing steadier. "If anything, my lack of schooling makes me the most qualified to lead this trust. Because I know what it means to be denied. And I know how to fight for it. This foundation isn't just about me, it's about every child who's ever been told they aren't worth the price of a book." By the time she finished, several council members were nodding. The chair glanced at Richard. "Mr. Caldwell, do you support this fully?" Richard stood. "With every resource I have." The motion passed unanimously. The Duroji Education Trust was officially recognized. That evening, Amara returned to the schoolyard to find volunteers already lining up, teachers offering to donate time, parents eager to enroll their children. Her name was spreading not as scandal, but as strength. Across town, however, Mrs. Duroji's life was unraveling. The flyers she had distributed had backfired, journalists traced them to her directly. Former neighbors came forward with stories of how she exploited children in her care. Families who once respected her now crossed the street to avoid her. Her own children, embarrassed, refused to show their faces at their private school. Sitting in her dim living room, Mrs. Durogier clutched a newspaper with Amara's face on the front page. Street girl becomes city hero. Her hands shook with rage. That ungrateful wretch, she hissed. She'll pay for this. But the world was shifting beyond her grasp. Meanwhile, Amara tucked Toby into bed, whispering, "Mama always said education is inheritance." Tonight, I think she'd be proud. Richard, standing quietly at the door, smiled. She would be. And so am I. Spring sunlight poured over the new schoolyard as children laughed and scribbled in their brand new notebooks. Rows of desks gleamed in freshly painted classrooms. The official opening ceremony for the Durogi Education Trust's first learning center had drawn a large crowd: reporters, city officials, donors, and curious neighbors. Amara stood at the podium, wearing a simple blue dress. Toby and Lila sat proudly in the front row beside Richard. Behind her, a banner read, "Education for every child." She cleared her throat, steadying her voice. When I was 10 years old, I stood barefoot in the sun, selling bottles of water I could barely lift. I wanted a book, a pencil, a desk, but I was told education wasn't for children like me. Today, I stand here to prove that was a lie. The audience erupted in applause. Amara lifted her chin higher, the strength in her words carrying far. Suddenly, a sharp voice pierced the noise. Lies. Gasps rippled as heads turned. Mrs. Funk Durogi pushed through the crowd, her expensive wrapper dragging across the dust. Her face was twisted with rage. You dare use my name for this farce? You were nothing but a beggar I pitied. I fed you, clothed you, this is how you repay me. Security moved forward, but Amara raised a hand. Let her speak. Mrs. Durogia's voice rose, shrill with desperation. You think these people respect you? You're still the same street rat, Amara. You'll never erase who you truly are. A hush fell. All eyes shifted back to Amara. For a moment, the old sting of humiliation burned in her chest. But she drew a breath, remembering the children behind her, the foundation in her hands. This was no longer just about revenge, it was about setting the record straight for every child like her. She stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. Yes, I was a street hawker. Yes, I begged for school and was denied. And yes, you, Mrs. Durogi, were the one who made me sell water instead of learning my ABCs. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously. But look around you, Amara continued, sweeping her hand toward the classrooms, the children smiling at their desks. This is who I am now. And this is who those children will become, because I turned your cruelty into fuel. I took the name you tried to bury me under and carved it into the stone of justice. Every child who learns here will carry your name, not as a mark of pride, but as proof that no betrayal can stop the future. The audience erupted in cheers. Some even stood, clapping. Mrs. Durogia's face blanched as cameras swiveled toward her. She tried to speak, but the roar of applause drowned her out. Humiliated, she stumbled back through the crowd, reporters chasing after her with questions. Amara exhaled slowly, her hands trembling, but not from fear. For the first time, she felt free. Richard rose from the front row, clapping the loudest. His eyes shone with pride. The sun was setting over New York, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose. Inside the new learning center, the last of the children had gone home, their laughter still echoing faintly in the halls. Amara stood alone in one of the classrooms, running her hand along a row of desks. Each one gleamed like a promise, each chair waiting for a child who would never have to beg for knowledge the way she once did. Behind her, Richard's voice broke the quiet. They'll never forget this day. And neither will I. She turned to see him leaning against the doorframe, his tie loosened, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. Lila skipped in beside him, clutching Toby's hand. The little boy's cheeks were flushed with health now, his inhaler clipped neatly to his pocket. "They made me draw on the blackboard today," Toby said proudly. "I wrote my name." Amara's throat tightened. She crouched and hugged him, whispering, "Mama would be so proud." Richard stepped closer. "So would she of you. You've built something I never could, not with all the money in the world." Amara studied him for a long moment. She had once thought men like him were untouchable, immune to the cries of the poor. But he had faced his sins, confessed them openly, and chosen to walk beside her instead of above her. Slowly, she nodded. "Maybe we both built this. You gave the bricks, I gave the fire." He smiled faintly. "And together, we'll keep it burning." They walked outside as dusk deepened. The sign above the gate gleamed in new paint, the Duroji Education Trust. Passers-by paused to read it, some with curiosity, some with admiration. Amara tilted her chin toward the sign, her voice low but steady. "For years, she forced me to hawk bottled water on the streets, humiliated me, told me I would never know letters or numbers. She wanted my name buried in shame. Now hers is carved in stone, not for what she did, but for what I overcame. That is my revenge. That is my justice." Richard laid a hand on her shoulder. "And it's far more powerful than hate." Lila slipped her small hand into Amara's, gazing up with wide eyes. "Will you still teach me, even now you're famous?" Amara laughed softly, her first genuine laugh in years. "Always. Teaching you is what started all this." Together, the four of them stood beneath the glowing sign as the city lights blinked on around them. The billionaire who once turned away from a woman's plea, the homeless girl who once sold water barefoot, the little boy who once gasped for breath, and the daughter who had once forgotten how to smile, all bound now by a story greater than themselves. For Amara, it wasn't just the end of suffering. It was the beginning of an inheritance no one could ever steal again.